The wind was already mean before the shouting started. Dust pushed against Mara's face as she pulled her little sister behind her, one arm shielding, one hand gripping the girl's shoulder like her life depended on it. Maybe it did. Stay back from her, Mara said, voice steady but thin. They were cornered by 3 ranch hands outside the corral, men who smelled of sweat and whiskey, talking about debts and ownership like they were haggling over a mule. She didn't have a gun anymore. Just a broken rifle slung empty over her shoulder, the last thing their father left before he rode out and never came back. They said he died working off what he owed, but Mara always suspected they just took more than his labor. Lilia's small voice trembled behind her. Mara, they can't take me, can they? No, honey. No one's taking you. She said it fast, but her eyes betrayed the lie. The tallest man stepped forward, boots crunching over gravel. You girls owe the ranch. The kid can work the kitchen. You... His grin turned filthy. You can decide what you're worth. Mara's throat burned, but she didn't move. Not even when her knees begged her to run. She'd been running all her life. From town gossip, from hunger, from men who thought a woman alone was free to claim. Not today. Then a shadow moved from the edge of the road. A horse snorted. The men turned first, laughter fading. And that's when she saw him. He wasn't a savior, not the kind she'd prayed for in the cold nights. He was a broad figure under a gray coat, hat low, reins held in a gloved hand. Cale Hawthorne. She knew the name. Everyone did. The widower who'd buried his family up on the ridge, the man folks said talked more to his ghosts than the living. He didn't say a word. Just rode closer, slow as a storm rolling in. The air changed. Quieter, heavier. Evening, one of the ranch hands tried, forcing a grin. Didn't mean no harm here, Cale, just collecting what's owed. Cale stopped his horse, boots hitting dirt as he dismounted. Looks like you've collected enough. His voice was calm, flat, like a shovel hitting packed earth. No one breathed. The men muttered something about misunderstanding, then backed off, retreating down the road. Mara wanted to thank him, but her tongue stuck. She didn't trust men who did things without asking for something in return. Cale turned to her. You're both under my roof now. It wasn't a question, and it sure didn't sound like mercy. Mara's instinct was to say no, to spit it right back. But Lilia tugged her sleeve. The girl's eyes were wide, scared, hopeful. Mara looked at Cale again, at the roughness carved into his face, at the loneliness that hung on him like dust. Something in her chest eased. Not trust, not yet, but something that felt close. He lifted Lilia onto his horse without asking, gentle as if he'd done it before. Maybe he had once. Then he looked at Mara. You coming or not? She hated that she hesitated. Hated that the road behind her was empty and the future ahead looked like someone else's choice. When she finally took his hand, it felt like surrender and defiance tangled together. His grip was solid, not soft, but it steadied her. As they rode away, Mara kept glancing over her shoulder, at the town shrinking behind them, at the men still watching, at the place where her father's debts had buried everything good they had left. She didn't know where this rancher was taking them, or why, but as the sun dipped behind the hills, a thought rose quietly in her mind. Maybe the road she'd feared all her life wasn't running away anymore. Maybe for the first time it was leading somewhere. Still, as the wind pressed against her back and the stranger rode ahead, one question wouldn't leave her. Who saves a woman like her? And what does he want in return? The rain had followed them for miles, thin and cold, the kind that seeps into bones no matter how tight you wrap your coat. By the time Cale led the horse through his gate, the sky had turned the color of pewter. The cabin waited ahead, a lone shape against the wild hills, smoke trailing lazy from the chimney. Mara's first thought was that it looked too still, too quiet, a place that hadn't known laughter in a long while. He helped Lilia down, careful, as if afraid she might break. The little girl whispered, "It smells like wood smoke." And Cale almost smiled. Almost. Then he pushed the door open and said, "It's not much, but it's dry. Inside." The room felt smaller than it looked. One stove, 2 chairs, and the kind of silence that carried old memories. Mara stood near the door, dripping rain, not sure whether to thank him or turn and run. She could feel her father's warnings echoing in her head. Don't owe no man what you can't repay. Cale tossed his hat onto a peg, unbuttoned his coat, and went straight to the stove. You both look half-starved, he said, matter of fact. There's beans in the pot. I didn't ask for your charity, Mara shot back, sharper than she meant to. He looked over his shoulder, calm, eyes unreadable. Then call it a trade. Something in the way he said it, not pity, not demand, made her pause. She didn't understand the man. Didn't trust him either, but in that moment, trust didn't seem as important as warmth. Lilia was already seated by the fire, cupping her hands near the flames, face glowing orange in the light. Mara joined her, though she kept glancing toward the door. Old habits die hard. Cale ladled food into 2 tin bowls, set them on the table, then sat across from them without a word. He ate slow, like someone who'd learned to make silence his companion. Mara's stomach twisted at the smell, hunger winning over pride. You live out here alone? She asked finally. Long enough to get used to it. He didn't look up. Must get quiet. He nodded. Quiet's better than what comes with company. That answer lingered. She didn't know if it was bitterness or truth, but it sounded like both. Later, when Lilia fell asleep wrapped in a spare blanket, Mara sat by the fire, rubbing her hands together. We'll be gone in the morning, she said softly, mostly to convince herself. Cale didn't look away from the flames. Suit yourself, but the storm won't. The wind picked up outside, whistling through cracks in the wood. Mara turned toward the window, rain slanting sideways, black sky splitting with distant thunder. She'd slept through worse, but not with a child beside her and nowhere left to run. When the first lightning flash hit, Lilia stirred, crying out. Mara pulled her close, whispering, It's just thunder, baby. She looked up. Cale was already there, standing by the doorway, lantern in hand, face caught between shadow and light. Storm'll pass, he said quietly. They always do. She wanted to believe him, but storms had a way of finding her, again and again. Still, the way he said it, steady, sure, eased something in her chest she hadn't realized was clenched. Hours later, the fire burned low. Cale had fallen asleep in his chair, hat tipped over his eyes, boots still on. Mara watched him from across the room, the man who'd taken them in without asking why. His face looked different in the firelight, less stern, almost sad. She wondered what kind of ghosts a man like him carried. Outside, the storm kept beating the roof, relentless. Inside, for the first time in years, Mara wasn't running. She didn't trust the peace yet. It felt borrowed, fragile. But as she listened to Lilia's breathing beside her, something strange happened. She exhaled, and in that small, uncertain breath, the world outside could rage all it wanted. Because for tonight, they had a roof, a fire, and a man who hadn't asked for anything in return, at least not yet. Morning light crept through the cabin window, brushing across the floorboards where Lilia's doll, a rag tied with twine, lay half buried in a blanket. The storm had passed, but the quiet it left behind felt heavier than thunder. Mara woke first. Her back ached from sleeping on the floor, but she didn't move. For the first time in weeks, Lilia slept soundly. She looked peaceful, face smudged from the night before, tiny hand curled around Mara's sleeve. It was a sight that always broke her heart, the kind of peace a child shouldn't have to earn. Cale was already outside, the door cracked open to the pale blue morning. She could hear him working, the steady rhythm of a hammer against wood, the low murmur of a man talking to his horse. Mara wrapped her shawl tighter and stepped out. The air smelled of damp soil and pine. Cale was mending a section of fence, sleeves rolled, hands sure. He didn't look up when she approached. Fence broke in the storm? She asked, voice softer than she meant. Been broke a while. Storm just made it honest. She almost smiled at that, the way he spoke like every broken thing had its truth. I can help, she said. He nodded toward a pile of rails. If you can lift, you can help. So she did. Side by side, they worked without talking much. The sun rose, burning off the mist, and for a while the world shrank to the sound of wood, wind, and breath. She realized she hadn't worked beside a man since her father, and that memory cut deep. The smell of sweat and sawdust dragging ghosts up from her chest. By noon, Lilia came running out with a tin cup of water, eyes bright. Mr. Hawthorne, look. I found eggs in the coop. Cale wiped his brow and grinned faintly. Guess the hens forgave the storm faster than we did. Lilia giggled, darting back toward the cabin. Mara caught the change in Cale's face. the shadow that flickered and then hid again. Lost plain as day. She wondered about the wife he'd buried, the child the town whispered about. When she spoke again, her tone was careful. You had a family once. He didn't flinch. Still do. They're just quieter than they used to be. The words settled heavy between them. That night, the firelight painted everything in soft gold. Lilia slept early, worn out from chasing chickens. Cale sat near the hearth, whittling something from a scrap of pine. Mara watched him work, the knife glinting, the curls of wood falling like feathers. You don't say much, she said finally. Words never fixed much. Maybe not, she replied, but sometimes they keep people from feeling alone. He paused then, knife still in his hand. The silence stretched, full but not empty. Finally, he offered the small carving, a wooden horse, rough but honest. Give that to your sister, he said. Mara turned it over in her fingers. You made this? He nodded, eyes on the fire. Had a little girl once. She liked horses. Something in her chest ached, not pity, recognition. Two people, both guarding ghosts, pretending the world hadn't broken them. When she lay down that night, she heard the creak of his chair by the fire, steady and patient. The warmth reached her even across the room. For the first time in years, she didn't dream of running. In the dark, she realized what felt so strange about this cabin. It wasn't the safety or the silence. It was that neither one of them had asked the other for anything. Yet somehow, both had begun to give. Outside, snow started to fall again. Slow, quiet, forgiving. And the cabin, for once, didn't feel like a stranger's shelter. It felt like something waiting to heal. The thaw came early that spring, melting the snow into rivers that carved through the valley like veins. Cale's ranch stirred back to life. Fences mended, horses restless, air heavy with the smell of wet earth. But the quiet peace that had filled the cabin these past weeks had started to fray, one unspoken thought at a time. Mara felt it first. The distance, the way Cale would look at her and then look away too quickly, as if remembering something he wished he could forget. The town had begun to talk. She could feel it long before they rode in. Lilia needed medicine, so they went together. The road to Dust Hollow was rutted and slick, and conversation between them was as thin as the wind. Mara tried to speak once, about the hens, about Lilia learning to read, but every word seemed to fall short. When they finally reached town, eyes followed them from every porch. The saloon door swung once, then stilled. Cale tied the horse, said quietly, "Best keep your chin up," and stepped inside the general store. Mara hated how the room changed when they walked in, how the old men by the stove stopped talking, how Mrs. Hanley behind the counter smiled too sweet. "Didn't expect to see you, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, gaze flicking toward Mara. "Heard you've got company out there now." "A lady and a little girl, wasn't it?" Mara felt heat rise to her neck. Cale's jaw tightened. "They're under my care. That's all." Mrs. Hanley's smile thinned. "That's mighty kind of you." Folks were wondering what sort of care that might be. The air turned thick. Cale dropped coins on the counter, gathered the supplies, and left without a word. Outside, Mara followed, heart pounding. What did she mean by that? She asked when they reached the wagon. He didn't answer, just adjusted the reins, jaw locked. "Cale," he exhaled. "It's the same story this town tells every time they see something they don't understand." She crossed her arms. "And what do they think we are?" He looked at her then, really looked. And in his eyes she saw the same shame she'd seen in every man who cared but didn't want to. "They think you're a woman I took in for reasons that don't need explaining." Her voice cracked, low and sharp. "And you let them think it?" He turned away. Ain't much I can say that'd change their minds. That night, back at the cabin, the silence between them was worse than any argument. Lilia slept soundly, unaware. The fire burned low, but Mara couldn't sit still. "You could have said it wasn't true," she whispered finally. "You could have told her who I am." Cale didn't lift his head. "And what would that change?" "Tomorrow they'd say another thing." "That's what towns do." Her throat tightened. "Then you should have left us there. Saved yourself the talk." He looked up slowly, eyes shadowed. "You think I care what they say?" "I think you do," she said, voice trembling. "I think it eats at you more than you'll admit." He didn't answer. The quiet dragged, and for the first time she saw the distance wasn't anger, It was guilt. Not for her, but for someone long gone. Your wife, she said softly. You still wear that loss like armor. He flinched. Barely, but enough. The truth had hit home. She took her shawl from the chair, fingers trembling. I won't live under a man's pity. Mara, no, she said, steady now. You should go. Or I will. The fire cracked. He looked at her across the dim room, wanting to speak, but the words never came. When she finally walked out, the wind howled through the doorway, scattering the warmth they'd built. Cale sat motionless, staring at the empty chair across from him, the one she'd used every night since the storm. Outside, her footsteps faded into the dark. Inside, his heart did the same. He'd lost count of the hours since she left. Cale sat by the window, lantern nearly out, the ranch around him too quiet. He'd thought silence was a friend once. Tonight it was punishment. Every creak in the walls sounded like her voice. Every gust of wind carried the echo of her boots fading down the road. He told himself she'd make it fine. She was strong, stronger than most men he'd known. But the thought of her and that child out there alone, with those same men prowling the canyons, gnawed at him like hunger. By the time dawn brushed pale light across the hills, his mind was made. He saddled his horse, grabbed his rifle, and rode. No hesitation, no breakfast, no plan. Just a feeling that if he didn't move now, he'd never forgive himself. The trail was easy to read. 2 sets of prints, smaller ones beside. They'd headed east, toward the canyon road. He knew what that meant. The same ranch hands who'd tried to take Lilia once had been spotted out that way again. Mara had gone straight into danger without knowing it. The sound of gunfire came faint, carried on the wind. Cale pressed his heels into the horse's sides, and the world blurred. Dust, rock, wind, fear. When he found them, the scene was chaos. Mara stood with a broken branch in her hands, fierce as a storm, shielding Lilia behind her. 2 men advanced, laughing, one holding a rope. Cale didn't think, he just fired. One dropped instantly, the other ran for cover. The air exploded with dust and echoing shots. Lilia screamed. Mara froze for a split second, then turned, eyes wide. And there he was, stepping through the smoke. You, she whispered, half disbelief, half relief. Couldn't let you finish what I started, he said, voice rough. He reloaded, fired again, and silence fell. The canyon held its breath. When it was over, she just stared at him, trembling. His sleeve was torn, blood blooming through the fabric, but he barely seemed to notice. Why'd you come? She asked quietly. He looked down at her. The woman who'd challenged him, softened him, scared him in ways he'd forgotten he could feel. Because you were right, he said. They should have stayed back, and I should have never let you go. She wanted to argue, but her voice broke instead. You can't just ride in and fix everything, Cale. I don't aim to fix it, he replied. I aim to keep it from breaking worse. She laughed then, short, tired, but real. And in that sound, something inside both of them loosened. Later, when they reached the cabin again, Lilia was already asleep on the wagon seat, her small hand clutching that wooden horse he'd carved. Mara sat by the fire while Cale cleaned the wound on his arm, refusing to rest. You're a stubborn man, she murmured. He gave a quiet smile. Takes one to know one. They fell into silence again, but it wasn't the cold kind anymore. It was full, heavy with words that didn't need saying. Finally she spoke. When we came here, I thought we were just passing through. I didn't think we'd belong anywhere again. Cale looked at her, eyes soft in the lantern light. Maybe belonging ain't a place. Maybe it's just the people you'd ride through hell to find. Outside, dawn crept over the ridge, turning the valley gold. The land that once felt cruel now looked almost gentle, like it too was learning forgiveness. Lilia stirred in her sleep, whispering his name. Mara watched him watch her, and in that moment, she saw not a lonely rancher, but the start of something steady, something earned. Cale reached out, resting a rough hand on hers. You're home now, he said simply, and as the first light spilled across the room, the fire caught again, warm, alive, carrying 3 hearts into a new morning that finally felt like peace.